After a long business trip in Europe, I hired musicians to surprise my fiancée. But when I knocked, a guy opened the door and said, "Who are you looking for?" Then my fiancée ran out topless behind him, eyes wide, and I spent 6 weeks in Europe for a project my company had been planning for nearly a year. It was the kind of trip that sounded glamorous from afar, but in reality meant airports, conference halls, cheap hotel coffee, and long hours sitting at tables under bright lights while people argued about budgets and deadlines. By the end of it, I felt stretched thin and more tired than proud. The only thing keeping me steady through the last week was the idea of going home to Lena. I imagined her at the door, half surprised and half annoyed that I didn't warn her I'd come back early. That image kept me alive on the longest flights and the quietest nights abroad. The morning before my return, while still in Zurich, I had a stupid but charming idea. I saw a trio of street musicians playing in a small square not far from the hotel. There was nothing special about them. A man with a battered violin, a woman playing a small accordion, and a guy with a drum that looked older than he was. They played with a kind of cozy energy that made strangers stop and smile. I watched them for a while and suddenly thought, that's the sound she should hear when she opens the door. Something warm, something celebratory, something unlike the life we'd fallen into before my trip, a routine where both of us were constantly tired and waiting for the weekend to catch up on things we didn't finish. The idea stuck. When I landed back home the next day, I didn't go straight to the apartment. I searched for local musicians who took small gigs quickly. It took longer than I expected, but by late afternoon, I found a group willing to follow me to the building and play something gentle near the door. I imagined this would be one of those moments couples joke about years later, the kind that becomes part of the crown jewel memories of a long marriage. By early evening, everything was arranged. The musicians waited near my building in a semicircle, tuning their instruments and chatting while I took a moment to breathe. My suitcase sat by my leg as I rehearsed the moment in my head. I pictured Lena's startled, bright expression. I pictured her jumping into my arms. I pictured her saying the trip felt like forever and she couldn't wait anymore. My heart warmed just thinking about it. When the musicians started playing and I stepped toward our door, I felt almost nervous. Not the bad kind. The kind that comes before something meaningful. I lifted my hand and knocked. That moment, right before the door opened, is still perfectly clear in my mind. The music was soft behind me, slightly uneven because they were nervous too. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. My pulse sat high in my throat. Everything in my life was exactly where I believed it should be. Then the door opened. A man I had never seen in my life stood in the doorway. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. Barefoot, wearing only loose athletic shorts. Hair wet as if he had just showered, not the slightest hint of awkwardness on his face. He stared at me like I was the one who had knocked on the wrong door. For a moment I couldn't speak. My brain tried to place him somewhere. Friend of a coworker, neighbor, delivery driver, old classmate, but nothing fit. He had a casual expression that irritated me instantly, as if I was interrupting his evening. I managed to say hello, but even that came out strange and tense. He didn't return the greeting. He simply asked who I was looking for. His tone wasn't rude. It was worse than rude. It was indifferent. Behind me the musicians kept playing, because that's what musicians do when they don't know they're witnessing the start of a disaster. A few neighbors opened their doors to see what the noise was about. Before I answered the man, a movement inside the apartment caught my attention. Something fast, something frantic. Then Lena appeared. She wasn't dressed. She had wrapped herself in a blanket so quickly that she hadn't even closed it properly. Her hair was messy, not in a sleepy way, but in a rushed, chaotic way. Her face went from surprise to shock to panic in seconds. I had never seen her look like that in all the years we were together. I tried to step inside on instinct, but she lifted her hand sharply, almost as if she wanted to keep me out. I froze. I didn't know what to think or what to feel. My mind tried to catch up with my eyes, but nothing made sense. I had left her in a quiet, scheduled life. I returned to something loud and disordered. The man in the doorway didn't move aside. He didn't look threatened or worried. He looked mildly irritated, as if he wanted me to hurry up and say something so he could get back to whatever he was doing. That expression burned through my confusion and ignited something sharp in my chest. The hallway kept filling with tiny sounds, the creak of a door opening, the shift of a neighbor stepping forward, the musicians hesitating mid-song as they realized the moment wasn't romantic anymore. I finally asked the man who he was. My voice came out too steady, like I was pretending to be calm for everyone watching. He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward Lena, as if waiting for her to handle it. She was breathing fast, clutching the blanket with both hands, trying to form words she couldn't find. Her eyes darted between me and the man. The more she hesitated, the more the ground under me shifted. When she finally spoke, it wasn't an explanation. It wasn't even a greeting. It was something like a broken apology mixed with shock, and it confirmed what I already sensed even if I didn't want to admit it. That was the first crack. I stepped forward again, but the man moved subtly as though guarding the doorway. Not threatening, just obstructing in a way that told me he felt at home. That detail struck me like a punch. He felt ownership of the space, or at least familiarity. I asked him again who he was. This time he said he was a friend of Lena's. The word friend felt too small for the scene I was looking at, and he said it with a level of ease that almost made the hallway spin. The music finally stopped. One of the musicians whispered something to another. Someone down the hall gasped softly. It all felt unreal, like I had stepped into a scene in someone else's life and couldn't figure out the script. Then I heard movement inside the apartment again. Not behind Lena. Deeper. Someone else was there. A moment later, a woman stepped out, holding a purse and wearing a guilty expression that didn't require any interpretation. It was Lena's friend Rita. She looked between me, Lena, and the man, and her face tightened as if she wished she could evaporate. She muttered something to Lena and tried to slip past me without meeting my eyes. That was the second crack. The picture was forming fast, and it didn't look anything like the life I believed I had. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. My mind shut down long enough to keep me from exploding. I told Lena I would come back for my things later and stepped away from the door. The musicians stood awkwardly, unsure whether to pack up or apologize. I nodded to them and said they could leave. As they walked off, I saw something that tightened every muscle in my body. The man, this stranger, this friend, leaned over casually and typed the building's entry code into the keypad. He hadn't asked anyone for it. He didn't look for it. He knew it. That was the third crack. I walked out of the building with my suitcase, past the musicians, past the neighbors, past the streetlights that suddenly felt too bright for what I had just seen. My heartbeat was loud. My thoughts refused to line up. Everything I had imagined on the flight home dissolved into something jagged and foreign. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was overwhelmed or heartbroken, but because nothing made sense yet, and my mind wouldn't rest until I understood what exactly I had walked into. And no matter how I replayed that moment, one question kept rising above all the others. How long had this been going on? Because it clearly wasn't new. Not with his posture, not with her panic, and not with the way she looked at me, as if my arrival was the real disaster, not whatever had been happening behind that door. I spent the night at my friend Nico's place. He lived in a small studio above a bakery, and the smell of fresh bread drifting in at dawn didn't make anything better. He tried to talk to me, but I wasn't ready. I kept replaying the image of that man opening my door like it was his home, and the way Lena reacted, not with joy, not with shock that I was back early, but with the frantic expression of someone who'd been cornered. When morning came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The confusion from the night before settled into something heavier. Not rage, not fear, something like a thick fog of disbelief. I needed answers, and the only place to get them was our apartment. So I thanked Nico, grabbed my suitcase, and walked back. The building looked different in daylight, even though nothing had changed physically. It felt like an unfamiliar place, somewhere I had lived but no longer belonged to. The elevator ride up felt endless. When I reached the hallway, I hesitated before knocking. I didn't want another stranger opening my door. This time Lena answered. She wore a loose sweater, her hair tied back in a way that suggested she had been awake for hours. Her eyes were puffy, and she looked like she wasn't sure if she should be relieved or terrified to see me. She stepped aside, giving me space to enter. The moment I walked in, the smell hit me first. Alcohol, stale perfume, and the faint bite of cigarette smoke. The living room looked like something had swept through it overnight. On the couch were blankets in a twisted pile, an open bottle of wine on the floor, cans lined across the coffee table, and a chair turned sideways against the wall as though someone bumped into it and didn't bother to fix it. This wasn't the aftermath of two people hanging out. This was the aftermath of a long, messy night that none of them expected to be caught. I walked past her and set my bag down without speaking. She closed the door slowly, watching me as if the weight of the entire situation depended on her next move. She finally asked if we could talk. I told her we were already talking. She hesitated again, struggling to decide where to begin. I could see her building a story in her head, trying to make pieces fit into something that sounded reasonable. But before she could start, I noticed something on the table that froze me in place. Our wedding folder. Open. Pages scattered. Some missing. It was the binder where we kept everything. Receipts, booking confirmations, scribbled notes about the guest list, the venue layout, the catering schedule, the payment timeline. I picked it up and flipped through it. Several sections were empty where they shouldn't have been. I looked at her and asked when she last touched it. She said she didn't remember. Her answer rang hollow. I kept flipping pages, and she finally stepped closer, trying to take it from my hand. I didn't let go. Something in her eyes told me she feared what I might find more than anything I could ask her. I closed the binder and set it aside. I told her to start explaining from the beginning, and she said last night was a mistake, that she didn't plan anything, that I had no idea how stressful the past weeks had been without me. The moment she said that, something inside me tightened. Stress doesn't explain a half-dressed man in your hallway. Stress doesn't explain why your friend was sneaking out with a guilty expression. Stress doesn't explain why the entire apartment smelled like someone lived there comfortably for more than one night. Before I could reply, a sound came from the hallway leading to the kitchen. Footsteps. Heavy, familiar, not rushed. A second later, Oscar appeared. He walked out casually, wearing a clean shirt this time, acting as though it was normal to be in my home during a conversation I had waited all night for. When he saw me, he didn't flinch. He only nodded slightly, then looked at Lena to gauge how she wanted him to behave. I looked at her, then at him, and asked if he planned on explaining anything. He said he didn't see why he needed to. The way he said it made my blood run cold. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't guilty. He was comfortable. That was worse than any confession. I asked him how long he had been staying here. He shrugged. That shrug told me the truth before he opened his mouth. He said he spent a couple of nights because he and Lena had been talking through some things. He said it like he was helping her through emotional turmoil, a kind of support role he had apparently assigned himself in my absence. I turned to Lena and asked her directly, how long had this guy been staying here? She said it wasn't like that. Every part of her expression told me it was exactly like that. Before the conversation turned into something louder, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Rita. I didn't want to read anything from her, but something compelled me to open it. She wrote that she needed to talk to me privately. She said last night spun out of control because Lena had been drinking heavily. She said she didn't plan for everything to collide the way it did. She asked me to call when I left the apartment. Her message didn't defend Lena. It didn't explain Oscar. It didn't make excuses. It only suggested that there was more to the story than what I had witnessed. I put my phone away, and Lena tried to reach out, placing her hand against my arm as if that simple gesture would glue the pieces back together. I stepped back. I asked her one question. Had she invited him over knowing I could come home that week? She said she didn't think I'd return early. She said she assumed I'd tell her. The words hit me harder than I expected. She assumed I wouldn't come home without warning. As if a surprise return was a violation. As if my spontaneity was the problem. I told them both I needed a moment and walked into the bedroom. It looked untouched, but something felt off. I scanned the room and noticed one of my drawers slightly open. Inside, some of my clothes were folded differently, and some were missing entirely. I checked the closet. A few of my shirts were gone. I walked back out and asked if someone had moved my things. Lena looked instantly nervous. Oscar didn't say anything, but his silence said plenty. I didn't ask more. I grabbed my suitcase and told Lena that I would pick up the rest later. She asked if I was leaving. That question echoed with the kind of irony only someone blind to their own actions could produce. Before I walked out, she said she wanted to talk later, when things calmed down. I didn't answer. I stepped outside the apartment and closed the door behind me. Halfway down the hallway, I realized something else. The keypad to the building's front door was changed a month ago. Only residents received the new code by email. I checked the system logs last week when the HOA asked for confirmation, which meant Oscar hadn't been coming in occasionally. He had been coming in like someone with full access. I left the building and walked several blocks until I found a quiet bench. I sat down and finally called Rita. She didn't wait for me to speak. She apologized instantly and started explaining everything at once. She said Lena had been struggling for weeks. She said she had doubts about the wedding. She said Oscar wasn't some random guy. She said he had been around more often lately, and that last night was more chaotic than planned. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said she wanted to tell me something Lena wouldn't admit. I asked her what she meant. Rita paused, then said, Lena had canceled part of the wedding arrangements 2 weeks ago. Not yesterday. Not last night. 2 full weeks before I came home. When I asked why, Rita went quiet. And then she said the words that marked the moment everything turned from confusion to something deeper and far more unsettling. Lena didn't cancel because of pressure. She canceled because she thought the wedding might not happen. Not because of me, but because she had been thinking of leaving. That silence afterward felt heavier than the entire night before. The shock at the door, the man standing in my hallway, the musicians freezing mid-song. None of that compared to this. Because for the first time, I understood something I hadn't wanted to consider. This hadn't started the night I came home. I sat on that bench long after the call ended, staring at nothing in particular. The street around me moved like a different world. People passed by carrying groceries, talking on phones, walking dogs, living lives that weren't coming apart in slow motion. I watched cars glide through the intersection and felt the strange sensation of being outside my own body, as if the night before had been a bizarre movie and I was waiting for the credits to roll. But the credits didn't come. Rita's voice kept echoing in my head. She had been thinking of leaving. She canceled parts of the wedding weeks ago. I wanted to be angry, but I wasn't there yet. I was still stuck in disbelief, looping through the timeline in my head, trying to figure out when the version of my life I believed in had diverged from the version Lena had been living. Eventually, I stood up and decided to confront the situation the only productive way, step by step. The first stop was the wedding coordinator. I knew she kept records of every change, every note, every adjustment. If Lena canceled anything, there would be timestamps, emails, maybe even explanations. The office was only a 15-minute walk away. I didn't call ahead. I wanted to see the reaction on the coordinator's face when I told her why I was there. She recognized me immediately and looked confused that I was back so soon from Europe. I told her I needed to understand the status of the wedding preparations. She hesitated at first, probably unsure if she was allowed to show me anything without Lena present, but I explained that I was trying to fix a problem rather than cause trouble. She eventually sighed and opened her computer. She showed me the record of recent changes. 2 canceled payments. 1 postponed catering meeting. 1 request to pause all vendor confirmations until further notice. 3 of those had been submitted 2 weeks ago. 1 was submitted 9 days ago. I asked if she had spoken with Lena directly about these changes. She nodded. She said Lena told her she needed time because the relationship was under stress. She didn't specify what kind of stress. She simply said she was unsure if the current timeline was realistic anymore. The coordinator tried to frame it gently, but the implication hung in the air like a weight. Lena wasn't planning anything with me in mind. Not anymore. I thanked her and left, but by the time I stepped outside, something had shifted. The confusion was thinning, replaced by a sharper feeling I couldn't ignore. I didn't want assumptions. I wanted facts. And there was only one person who had been close enough to Lena recently to know the details, Rita. So I called her again and asked if we could talk in person. She suggested meeting at a small cafe halfway between our places. I walked there slowly, trying to keep my breathing even. When Rita arrived, she looked as if she hadn't slept either. She sat across from me and began talking before the server even brought water. She said the night I came home wasn't supposed to look like that. Lena had planned a small, cooling-off evening with her and Oscar. They had been drinking, venting about stress, laughing, and the situation spiraled. She said she didn't know Oscar would stay the night, but the tone in her voice made me doubt that. I asked Rita how long Oscar had been in the picture. She didn't answer at first. She glanced down, then said Lena met him months ago through a fitness class she'd been attending. At first they were just friendly. Then they started talking more while I was abroad. Rita insisted it wasn't physical at the beginning, but the way she said it made me think even she didn't believe it. I asked her what Lena meant when she told Oscar she found something disturbing about me. The moment I said it, Rita's expression tightened. She asked how I knew about that. I told her she mentioned it to Oscar, and someone overheard. I didn't give details. She shifted uncomfortably and said that a couple of weeks ago, Lena received a message from an anonymous social media account. It contained a photo of me. She said the picture showed me at a work banquet in Europe with a female colleague. In the photo, I was holding her with both arms, and her face was close to mine, almost touching. The description didn't fit any reality I knew. My mind searched my memories of the trip. Nothing even close surfaced. I asked Rita if I could see the photo. She hesitated, then finally opened her phone and scrolled through her gallery. She turned the screen toward me. It was me, standing in a banquet hall, holding a woman named Sophia, a project manager from Lisbon who had nearly fallen backward off a step after someone bumped into her while carrying a tray of drinks. I remembered grabbing her to steady her. The entire situation lasted maybe 3 seconds, and we laughed afterward. The picture captured the exact moment when I was pulling her upright, and her face was close to mine because she was regaining balance. Completely harmless in context. Completely incriminating without it. I exhaled slowly. Rita watched me, and I could tell she was waiting for an explosion. Instead, I asked the question that mattered most. Why didn't Lena ask me about it? Rita said she panicked. She thought the picture was proof of something she had been afraid of for months, that I was drifting away, that the distance between us was widening, that I was living a life she wasn't part of anymore. She said Lena didn't want to look foolish by confronting me if the picture turned out to be meaningless, so she kept it to herself. Then she leaned in, lowered her voice, and told me the part she hadn't wanted to admit. After she saw the photo, Lena started spending more time with Oscar. She told Rita she needed clarity. She told her she wanted to compare feelings. She told her she wasn't sure who she really wanted. That was when the fog in my head finally cleared. Lena hadn't panicked the night I came home. She had panicked because the situation she had built in secret suddenly collided with the life she was pretending to maintain. I thanked Rita for being honest. She apologized again, but apologies didn't matter anymore. The truth was the only thing I cared about. When I walked out of the cafe, the air felt colder than before. I stood for a moment, trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to leave everything where it was and never look back. But that wouldn't settle anything. I needed the full truth. And there was only one way left to get it. I went back home. When I reached the building, Lena wasn't there. Instead, her brother Timo opened the door. He was the least diplomatic person in her family. Loud, stubborn, and always convinced he knew what was best for everyone. He stepped into the hallway, blocking half the entrance with his arm. His expression wasn't sympathetic or even curious. It was confrontational, like he had already decided who the villain was. He told me Lena didn't want to talk. He told me she needed space. He told me I had upset her deeply last night. Every word pushed something inside me closer to snapping. I asked him what exactly she told him. He said she found out something about me weeks ago and had been struggling ever since. I asked what that something was. He said it wasn't his place to tell me. I said it was exactly his place if he intended to stand between me and my own home. He didn't answer. The silence stretched awkwardly. Timo shifted his weight, and I realized he didn't know the details either. He was defending her on principle, not truth. I stepped back and said I wasn't fighting with family members in hallways. I told him he could either let me talk to her, or he could step aside and let me gather my things. He agreed to the second option and moved. Inside, the place felt even smaller than before. I collected the essentials: clothes, toiletries, my laptop, documents. As I packed, I heard a door close somewhere in the building. It wasn't from inside our unit. It sounded like the floor above. I don't know why that detail bothered me. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the sense that someone was listening. Maybe I was simply tired of surprises. Before I left, I looked around one last time. This was supposed to be our home. Now it felt like a set piece from a life that wasn't real. When I stepped outside, Timo asked what I planned to do next. I told him I wanted the truth. All of it. Not pieces filtered through guilt or panic or assumptions. And the only way to get the truth was to gather everyone involved and force the story into the open. He didn't like the idea. He said it would make everything worse. I said everything was already worse. Then I walked past him, down the hall, out the door, and into the cold evening air. The plan forming in my head was simple. No more fragments. No more indirect conversations. No more half explanations. I was going to bring Lena, Oscar, Rita, and Timo into the same room. And by the time that meeting ended, I would finally know what kind of life I had been living while I was thousands of miles away. I spent the next morning arranging the one thing that would finally force this situation into daylight: a meeting with everyone involved. No separate explanations. No half-truths. No shifting stories behind closed doors. I wanted all of them in one place so the pieces would fall exactly where they belonged. I texted Lena first. I told her she didn't have to explain anything alone. I told her I wanted to hear everything with the people who had been part of it. She hesitated at first. I could see the bubbles of typing appear and disappear several times before she finally agreed. I told her to bring Oscar. She didn't argue. Rita agreed immediately when I messaged her. She said it was about time. Timo responded with a simple, "I'll be there," which meant he was coming to defend his sister, but I didn't care. His presence would only help cut through any fantasy version of events. I chose a neutral place. Nico's apartment was too small. The cafe from yesterday was too public. So I asked to use the community lounge in my building. It was quiet, plain, with enough chairs to keep everyone from pacing around. I booked it for the afternoon. When the time came, I arrived a few minutes early. My hands weren't shaking. My thoughts were steady. I finally felt like I had stepped out of the fog. Whatever the truth was, I was ready to hear it. Lena arrived first. She walked in with the look of someone who had been carrying too many emotions for too long. She sat down without saying anything, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Oscar came with her, but sat on the opposite side of the room. His expression was unreadable, calm, composed, arms crossed. He didn't seem guilty. He didn't seem nervous. He looked like someone who had become more confident in her chaos than she had. Rita walked in third, avoiding everyone's eyes. She took a seat closer to me, but not too close, as if giving me room to breathe. Timo arrived last. He shut the door behind him with more force than necessary and leaned against it like he expected a fight to break out at any moment. I waited a moment before speaking. Then I said the only thing that could begin this. We're all here so the truth doesn't get twisted anymore. They all looked at me. Lena finally nodded. I asked her to start from the beginning. She exhaled deeply and began. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't filled with excuses. It was just a quiet, strained admission of the truth she hadn't had the courage to tell me earlier. She said the wedding had stopped feeling right for her months ago. Not because of anything specific I did, but because she felt overwhelmed by the pace of everything. Work, planning, the idea of a life she wasn't sure she was ready for. She didn't know how to slow things down without hurting me, so she kept pretending everything was fine. Then she saw the photo. She said it arrived from a blank account with no profile picture. A single message. No explanation. Just the image of me holding my colleague with both arms. She stared at it for days. She didn't know how to bring it up. She felt embarrassed to even ask because she worried she would sound insecure or paranoid. She said the moment she received it, something shifted inside her. She started imagining the possibility that I had moved on emotionally while traveling. Instead of confronting me, she withdrew into herself. That was when Oscar stepped into her life. She admitted she had already known him from the fitness class, but they became closer only after the photo. He was someone who showed attention when she was vulnerable, someone who made her feel understood at a moment when she thought she had been replaced. She said she didn't plan anything romantic. She said it started with conversations, venting sessions, late-night texts. She said she needed reassurance from somewhere because she thought she had lost mine. At this point, Oscar shifted in his chair and finally spoke. He said he didn't take advantage of anything, that he and Lena had feelings grow naturally. He said they didn't intend to hurt me. He said everything just unfolded. I looked at him and asked whether he thought staying multiple nights in another man's home while that man was abroad was the natural route for those feelings. He didn't answer. Rita stepped in before the silence thickened. She admitted she had tried to warn Lena early on that she was handling the situation the wrong way. She said she told her to talk to me, to pause everything until I returned, to explain the photo to me directly. But Lena refused. She didn't want to risk feeling foolish if the picture was meaningless. I turned back to Lena. I asked about the wedding cancellations. She nodded slowly and said she panicked. She didn't want to walk into a marriage if she wasn't sure. But she also didn't want to hurt me by calling it off without sorting through her own confusion first. So she canceled a few things quietly to buy time. That answer hit harder than I expected. Not because it was malicious, but because it was cowardly in a deeply personal way. I asked her one final question. Was last night supposed to happen? She shook her head. She said it was supposed to be a small get-together. She said she wanted to unwind with two people who had been helping her through the mental mess she'd created. She said she didn't imagine I'd arrive that day. She said she wasn't prepared for the reality of everything colliding. It wasn't a justification. It wasn't even an apology. It was simply the truth. The room was quiet for a long moment. Everyone avoided looking directly at anyone else. Even Timo, who had come with a protective stance, looked down at the floor. I finally spoke. I told them I understood that people make mistakes, but there is a difference between a mistake and a choice. Lena had made choices. Layered ones. Quiet ones. Ones she hid from me. Each choice built another wall between us until she didn't know how to climb back. The wedding folder. The cancellations. The secret meetings. The photo she never asked me about. The nights Oscar spent at our place. The panic when she saw me at the door. None of that was a single moment gone wrong. It was a series of decisions that led us here. I told her we couldn't fix what she had broken. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because the foundation was gone. Trust had been replaced with secrecy. Partnership had been replaced with avoidance. She didn't argue. She only nodded. Slow, small movements that told me she already knew what was coming. I ended the engagement. I said it quietly, without emotion, without theatrics. It didn't need volume. It only needed clarity. Oscar stared at the table. Timo swallowed hard, but didn't protest. Rita closed her eyes, relieved the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Lena sat perfectly still, hands trembling in her lap. The conversation that followed was practical. We discussed the apartment. We discussed the remaining payments. We discussed returning each other's belongings. We discussed the wedding vendors and who would cover the fees. I paid my portion long ago. She covered the cancellations. Fair was fair. Within an hour, the meeting was done. We all walked out together, but not as a group. Just as people who happened to exit the same room. Lena went with Timo. Oscar followed them at a distance. Rita walked away quietly, and I headed toward the back exit, needing air that wasn't shared with anyone in that room. The first real breath I took outside felt heavy and clean at the same time, like something had ended and something else had opened. I didn't look back. Over the next week, everything unraveled officially. Lena moved in with Timo temporarily. She paid every penalty tied to the canceled wedding. Oscar drifted out of her life almost immediately afterward. Rita told me he stopped responding to her within days. Rita apologized again through a long message and admitted she cut ties with Lena shortly after the meeting. The apartment returned to feeling like a place rather than a wound. I moved out 2 weeks later anyway. Fresh start, clean slate. 3 months later, I transferred to a different department at work, one with fewer trips, less late-night stress, and more structure. I built a new routine that didn't involve questioning every moment. 6 months later, Lena reached out with a long message asking to talk. She wrote that she understood things too late. She wrote that she was ashamed. She wrote that she hoped life treated me well. I didn't respond. Not out of spite. Just because nothing needed to be reopened. Some stories don't end with dramatic outcomes. They end with a closed door, a clear mind, and a future that finally belongs to you again.